I want you to think about something for a second. Imagine you're sitting in a room. Two of the most powerful governments on the planet are on opposite sides of the table. 21 hours of negotiations, back and forth, proposals, counter-proposals, Pakistan's Prime Minister personally mediating, the entire world watching. And then one side stands up, picks up their briefcase, and walks out. That moment happened today, April 12th, 2026, Islamabad, Pakistan. And I can tell you right now, what happened in that room today is going to affect every single person watching this video. Whether you live in Tehran, whether you live in Texas, whether you've never even thought about the Middle East a day in your life. Because here's the thing nobody is saying out loud yet. This wasn't just a failed negotiation. This was a turning point. And I've spent the last several hours going through every detail, every statement, every demand, every walkout. And what I found is a story that is so much deeper, so much more dangerous, and so much more consequential than any headline you've read today. So stay with me, because by the time we're done, you are going to understand exactly what just happened, why it happened, and most importantly, what comes next. Let's get into it. Part 1. How the world ended up in Islamabad. Let me take you back 6 weeks. Because to understand why today's failure matters so much, you have to understand how we even got to that negotiating table in the first place. February 28, 2026, it was a date that changed everything. On that morning, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated large-scale military assault on Iran. Not a warning shot, not a limited strike, a full sustained military campaign targeting Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, oil installations, airports and power systems across the country. And within hours, the Middle East was on fire. Now I want to be very clear about something here, because a lot of people watching this might be asking, how did we get here? How did the world go from tense diplomacy to actual war in what felt like overnight? The truth is, it didn't happen overnight. This had been building for years, decades even. Layer after layer of mistrust, broken agreements, assassinations, proxy conflicts, sanctions and threats, all stacking on top of each other like a tower that everyone knew was going to fall eventually. And on February 28th, it fell. The opening strikes were devastating. American and Israeli forces targeted what officials described as Iran's most critical military and nuclear assets. But what followed was not the quick, clean surgical operation that some in Washington had hoped for. Iran hit back, hard. Iranian ballistic missiles rained down on American military bases across the region. The Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway through which nearly 20% of the world's oil flows every single day, was effectively shut down. Iranian proxy forces activated across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen simultaneously. Hezbollah began launching rockets into northern Israel at a scale that hadn't been seen since the 2006 war. Within 72 hours, the entire region was engulfed. Oil prices doubled. Global markets went into freefall. Shipping companies rerouted their vessels away from the Persian Gulf entirely. Countries that depend on Middle Eastern oil, Japan, South Korea, India, China, began emergency meetings to figure out how to keep their economies running. And the human cost was staggering. Cities across Iran took direct hits. Infrastructure that millions of ordinary Iranian people depend on every single day, power grids, water systems, hospitals, was damaged or destroyed. And on the other side, American military personnel across the region were under constant threat from missile strikes and drone attacks. For 40 days, this went on. 40 days of strikes, 40 days of retaliation, 40 days of the world holding its breath, wondering if this was the beginning of something that could spiral into a global catastrophe. And then, a phone rang in Islamabad. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had been quietly working behind the scenes since almost the very beginning of the conflict. Pakistan occupies a unique position in this entire situation. It has relationships with both sides. It has credibility with Iran rooted in shared Islamic identity and decades of diplomatic engagement. And it has a working relationship with the United States, rooted in decades of security cooperation. Sharif understood that someone had to step in. Someone had to create a space where both sides could step back from the edge without losing face. Because that's the thing about conflicts like this. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to peace isn't the actual disagreement. It's the fact that neither side can afford to look weak in front of their own people. Pakistan gave both sides a way out. And after weeks of quiet diplomacy, carrying messages back and forth between Washington and Tehran, Sharif finally announced something the world desperately needed to hear: a ceasefire. On April 7, 2026, just hours before a deadline that President Trump had set, deadline that came with the threat of, quote, complete demolition of Iranian infrastructure, Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump agreed to suspend military strikes for 2 weeks. The relief was immediate and global. Oil prices dropped. Shipping lanes began to cautiously reopen. World leaders released statements welcoming the pause. People in the streets of Tehran, exhausted, grieving, desperate for the bombs to stop, celebrated. But here's what the celebrations missed. A ceasefire is not a peace deal. A ceasefire is just two sides agreeing to stop shooting at each other temporarily while they figure out if they actually want to stop shooting at each other permanently. And the gap between those two things, temporary and permanent, is where everything gets complicated. Because when the American and Iranian delegations finally sat down face to face in Islamabad, for the first time at this level since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, what became immediately clear was that the distance between what Washington wanted and what Tehran was willing to accept was not a small gap. It was a canyon. America came to Islamabad with one core demand sitting at the center of everything: a fundamental, non-negotiable commitment from Iran that it would not develop nuclear weapons, not just a promise, not just a pledge, a verifiable, enforceable, permanent commitment with real consequences if violated. Iran came to Islamabad with its own list, and it was long: lifting of all sanctions, release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets, withdrawal of American combat forces from military bases across the region, compensation for the damage caused by 6 weeks of strikes, and critically, Iran's right to continue its nuclear enrichment program. Those two positions, in simple terms, are almost completely opposite. And 21 hours of negotiations in, Islamabad could not bridge that gap. J.D. Vance, leading the American delegation, walked out, boarded Air Force Two, and left. And the question that the entire world is now asking tonight is simple. What happens now? The nuclear question, the real reason everything collapsed. Let me tell you something that I think gets lost in all the noise around this conflict. Every time Iran and America have come close to a deal, and I mean every single time, there has been one issue that sits at the center of everything like an immovable wall. The nuclear question, not sanctions, not proxies, not the Strait of Hormuz, not frozen assets. The nuclear question. And until you truly understand what both sides actually want on this issue, and more importantly, why they want it, you cannot understand why Islamabad failed. You cannot understand why every previous attempt at a lasting agreement has ultimately collapsed. And you cannot understand what the road ahead actually looks like. So let me break this down for you from the very beginning. Iran's nuclear program did not start as a weapons program. It started in the 1950s, ironically with American help. Under a program called Atoms for Peace, the United States actually assisted Iran in developing civilian nuclear technology during the era of the Shah, nuclear reactors, technical training, the whole package. Then 1979 happened, the Islamic Revolution. Then 1979 happened, the Islamic Revolution. And overnight, America went from Iran's nuclear partner to Iran's most dangerous enemy. But the program continued, quietly. And over the following decades, through sanctions, through international pressure, through covert operations including a remarkable cyber attack called Stuxnet that physically destroyed Iranian centrifuges, Iran kept enriching uranium. And by the time we get to today, Iran's nuclear program is not a future threat. It is a present reality. Here as well, things get very serious. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, reported late in 2024 that Iran had enriched uranium to levels approaching weapons grade. Not quite weapons grade, but close enough that the technical gap between where Iran is and where it would need to be to build an actual nuclear device had shrunk to something that genuinely alarmed non-proliferation experts around the world. And the stockpile is what really keeps people up at night. Iran has accumulated enough highly enriched uranium that experts believe it could potentially produce enough fissile material for multiple nuclear weapons in a relatively short period of time. We are not talking about years anymore. We are talking about a timeline that is measured in weeks or months under certain scenarios. Now here is the critical thing to understand. Iran has never officially said it is building a nuclear weapon. In fact, Iran's supreme leader has issued religious edict stating that nuclear weapons are forbidden under Islamic law. Iran's official position has always been that its nuclear program is entirely civilian, for energy and medical research purposes. But here is what America, and frankly most of the Western world, looks at and cannot reconcile. You do not need uranium enriched to near weapons grade levels for a civilian nuclear program. Civilian nuclear power plants operate on uranium enriched to around 3 to 5%. Iran has been enriching to 60% and beyond. That is not a civilian enriching level. That is a level that has one primary application, and it is not generating electricity. So America's position coming into Islamabad was this: we are not going to sign any agreement at all, that leaves Iran with the capability to quickly convert its existing enriched uranium stockpile into nuclear weapons. The commitment we need is not just a promise not to build a bomb. It is a verifiable dismantling of the infrastructure and the stockpile that would allow Iran to build one quickly. And Iran's response to that position was essentially, absolutely not. Because here is how Iran sees this situation. And I want you to really hear this, because understanding Iran's perspective is essential to understanding why this conflict keeps repeating itself. Iran looks at the world and sees a very specific pattern. Countries that gave up their weapons programs or their weapons capabilities, Iraq, Libya, ended up with their governments destroyed and their leaders killed. Countries that held on to nuclear weapons or nuclear ambitions, North Korea, have never been invaded, have never had their governments overthrown, have never faced the kind of military campaign that Iran has just endured for 6 weeks. Iran's nuclear program, whether it ever produces a single weapon or not, is the ultimate insurance policy. It is the thing that makes America and Israel think twice. It is the deterrent that no amount of conventional military power can fully replace. Asking Iran to give that up completely, to dismantle the stockpile, to destroy the centrifuges, to permanently close the door on nuclear capability, is not just asking Iran to make a concession. It is asking Iran to make itself vulnerable in the most fundamental way possible. And Iran's leadership, whatever you think of them, is not going to do that. Not without guarantees that America has so far been completely unwilling to provide. Now there was a moment, one brief fragile moment, when both sides actually managed to bridge this gap, at least partially, the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Under that agreement, Iran agreed to dramatically limit its enrichment activities, reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, and allow intrusive international inspections in exchange for the lifting of crippling economic sanctions. It wasn't perfect. Iran didn't give up everything. America didn't give up everything. America didn't give up everything. But it was real. It was working. International inspectors were on the ground. Enrichment levels were coming down. The timeline to a potential Iranian nuclear weapon was being extended. And then in 2018, Donald Trump walked away from it. He called it the worst deal ever negotiated. He reimposed sanctions. And Iran, feeling betrayed, feeling that it had made painful concessions for nothing, began systematically dismantling every limit it had agreed to under the deal. Within a few years, Iran's enrichment levels had shot back up. The stockpile had grown larger than ever, and the hard-won progress of years of diplomacy had essentially evaporated. So when Iran sat down in Islamabad this week, sat down with the same Trump administration that walked away from the only deal that had ever actually worked, the trust deficit was not just large, it was almost total. Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf said it directly after the talks collapsed. He said the United States had failed to earn the trust of the Iranian delegation, that Iran had put forward-looking proposals, and that now it was up to Washington to decide whether it was capable of operating in good. Became scarce. Fuel in an oil-producing country became difficult to find in some areas because refineries had been hit. The people paying the price for this war are not the generals. They are not the politicians. They are not the politicians. They are not the IRGC commanders sitting in hardened underground dunkans. They are the pharmacist in Tehran who can't get insulin for her diabetic patients. They are the university student in Isfahan who doesn't know if his campus will still be standing tomorrow. They are the mother in Shiraz who hasn't slept in 6 weeks because every night she lies awake listening for the sound of incoming missiles. These are the people of Iran, and their suffering is real, and it is enormous. Now let me take you to the other side. Because American families have been living with their own version of this fear. The families of the thousands of American military personnel stationed across the Middle East have spent 6 weeks not knowing, truly not knowing, whether the base where their son or daughter or husband or wife is stationed is going to be hit tonight. Every ballistic missile strike on. An American base in the region sends ripples of terror through communities across America. Military families in small towns in Georgia, in suburbs of San Diego, in neighborhoods in North Carolina, checking their phones constantly, watching the news, waiting for a call they desperately hope never comes. And beyond the military families, ordinary American consumers have felt this war in their wallets in ways that are impossible to ignore. Gas prices. Every American who has filled up their tank in the past 6 weeks has paid a price for this conflict. The disruption to global oil markets caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz translated directly into higher fuel costs at gas stations from Maine to California, grocery prices, heating bills, airline tickets. The economic shockwaves of a war in the Persian Gulf do not stay in the Persian Gulf. They travel through energy markets, through supply chains, through financial systems, into the daily lives of ordinary Americans who have never thought about the Strait of Hormuz in their lives. And then there is Lebanon. And I want to spend a moment here because the human suffering in Lebanon right now is at a scale that deserves far more attention than it is receiving. Nearly 2,000 people killed since March. In a country that is already broken, Lebanon entered this conflict in a state of near total economic and political collapse, the result of years of mismanagement, corruption, and the devastating 2020 Beirut port explosion that killed over 200 people and destroyed entire neighborhoods. And into that already devastated country, a new wave of destruction has arrived. Families displaced from their homes in southern Lebanon, hospitals overwhelmed, infrastructure that was already barely functioning pushed past its limits, children growing up knowing nothing but fear and destruction. These are not statistics. These are human beings. And here is what I keep coming back to when I think about all of this. Every single one of these people, the Iranian mother listening for missiles, the American military family checking their phones, the Lebanese child who has never known peace, every single one of them is paying a price for decisions made by governments that claim to be acting in their interests. And none of them, not one of them, was in that room in Islamabad today. None of them got to say, "This is what I need. This is what would make my life better. This is what peace would mean to me." They are the voiceless center of a conflict defined entirely by the powerful, and that, more than any missile, more than any enrichment percentage, more than any diplomatic failure, is the true tragedy of what is happening right now. But there is still one more piece of this story we need to talk about. Because after everything, the failed talks, the human cost, the proxy fires burning across the region, there is still a question that demands an answer. Is there any path forward? Any realistic scenario where this ends without catastrophe? Or are we truly watching the beginning of something that cannot be stopped? Is there any way out? The road ahead, and what the world must choose. I've taken you through a lot today. The 40 days of war, the fragile ceasefire, the marathon talks in Islamabad that ended without a deal, the nuclear standoff that has defied solution for decades, the Strait of Hormuz and the economic weapon Iran refuses to surrender, the proxy fires burning across Lebanon, Iraq and Yemen, and the ordinary human beings on all sides who are paying the heaviest price for decisions they had no voice in making. And now I want to answer the question that I think every single person watching this video is sitting with. Is there any way out of this? I'm going to be honest at you. Completely honest, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve comfortable reassurances that everything is going to be fine. The honest answer is yes. There is a way out. There are actually several possible paths forward, but every single one of them requires something that has been in desperately short supply throughout this entire conflict. Political courage. Let me walk you through what those paths actually look like. The first path, and the most optimistic one, is a return to negotiations. Not tomorrow. Not next week, but eventually. Here is the thing about the Islamabad talks that I don't want you to miss in all the coverage of their failure. They happened. Face to face, the highest level direct engagement between American and Iranian officials since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Think about what that actually means. Two governments that have spent 47 years refusing to sit in the same room, sat in the same room. For 21 hours. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchi said it himself after the talks collapsed. No one expected a deal in a single session. The ministry spokesperson said Tehran was confident that contacts would continue through Pakistan and other regional friends, and J.D. Vance, despite his sharp words about Iran's refusal, did not say negotiations were permanently over. He said Iran had not accepted America's terms yet. Yet. That word matters, because here is the reality that both governments understand privately, even when their public statements suggest otherwise. The military option, the option of continuing this war until one side is completely defeated, does not produce a clean outcome for either side. America cannot bomb Iran's nuclear knowledge out of existence. You can destroy centrifuges, you can destroy facilities, but you cannot destroy the engineers. You cannot destroy the expertise. You cannot destroy the institutional knowledge that Iran has accumulated over decades of nuclear development. Within years, possibly less, Iran could rebuild, and Iran cannot militarily defeat the United States. It can make the conflict unbearably costly. It can bleed American resources and credibility across the region. It can keep the Strait of Hormuz in a state of perpetual tension, but it cannot win a conventional military victory against the most powerful military force in human history. So both sides are trapped in the same painful reality. Neither can win decisively, and the cost of trying is being paid by millions of ordinary people who just want to live their lives. That shared reality, that mutual recognition of the limits of force, is ultimately what brings governments back to the table. Always. Eventually. The second path, and this one is darker, is a managed frozen conflict. This is the scenario where no deal is reached. The ceasefire collapses or expires. Military operations resume at some level, but both sides, exhausted, economically damaged, facing domestic pressure, pull back from full-scale war without ever reaching a formal agreement, a kind of permanent low-grade hostility. Proxy conflicts continuing, periodic strikes, ongoing economic pressure. The Strait of Hormuz opening and closing depending on the political temperature. It is not peace, but it is not the catastrophic full-scale regional war that the worst-case scenarios describe either. This is actually as depressing as it sounds, probably the most likely short-term outcome, because it requires the least political courage from either side. You don't have to make a deal, you don't have to make concessions, you just have to not escalate beyond a certain threshold. The problem with this path is obvious. A frozen conflict is not stable. It is just a war that hasn't exploded yet. The underlying tension stirs the nuclear question, the proxy networks, the Strait of Hormuz, the fundamental mistrust. None of them get resolved. They just get deferred until the next crisis, the next miscalculation, the next moment when someone makes a decision that cannot be taken back. The third path, and this is the one that nobody wants to say out loud, is full-scale catastrophic escalation. The talks have collapsed. Trump is threatening to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's missiles are ready. Hezbollah is still firing into Israel. Iranian-backed militias are still attacking American personnel in Iraq. Any one of those pressure points, if mishandled, if miscalculated, if pushed 1 degree too far, could trigger a chain reaction that pulls in the entire region. That disrupts global oil supplies for months. That draws in China and Russia. That reshapes the entire international order in ways that would take generations to recover from. I am not saying this is inevitable. I am not saying it is even likely in the immediate term, but it is possible, and the gap between possible and actual is narrower tonight than it was this morning, and that should frighten all of us. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a moment of genuine historical choice. The governments involved, Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, and the regional powers watching from the sidelines, are going to make decisions in the coming days and weeks that will determine which of those three paths this situation travels down. And here is what I believe. After going through every piece of this story, every historical parallel, every strategic calculation, the only path that actually ends this, truly ends it, not just pauses it, is the path that requires both sides to do something that feels almost impossible after everything that has happened. Compromise, not surrender, not capitulation, not one side getting everything at once while the other gets nothing. Real compromise. The kind where both sides walk away having given something significant and having received something significant and having received something significant in return. America is going to have to accept that Iran will maintain some level of nuclear capability, not weapons-grade enrichment, not a bomb, but civilian nuclear infrastructure with serious, verified, intrusive international oversight. Iran is going to have to accept that its path to a nuclear weapon is permanently closed, not paused, not delayed, closed, with verification mechanisms that go beyond anything the 2015 deal required. America is going to have to offer Iran something real in return. Real sanctions relief, real economic engagement, real security guarantees that regime change is not the hidden agenda behind every diplomatic initiative. Iran is going to have to genuinely rein in its proxy network, not eliminate it overnight. That is not realistic, but a genuine verifiable reduction in the offensive capabilities of Hezbollah, the Houthis and the Iraqi militias that have been used to threaten American interests and Israeli civilians. None of that is easy. All of it is painful. Every single item on that list is going to face ferocious opposition from hardliners on both sides, who would rather keep fighting than make any concession to the enemy. But the alternative is what we are watching right now: cities in ruins, families torn apart, economies shattered, a generation of young Iranians growing up with bombs instead of futures, a generation of American military families living with fear instead of security, children in Lebanon who have never known what peace feels like. That is the cost of refusing to compromise, and it is being paid right now, today, by real people. I started this video by telling you about the moment that defined this story for me. J.D. Vance, star, standing up from that table in Islamabad, picking up his briefcase, walking out. And I want to end by telling you what I think that moment actually means. It doesn't mean peace is impossible. It means peace is hard. It means peace requires a kind of political courage and strategic imagination that has been absent from this conflict for decades. It means that the next chapter of this story has not been written yet. And here is the truth that I think matters most. The people who will ultimately determine which path this situation travels down are not just the presidents and the supreme leaders and the vice presidents and the foreign ministers. They are the people watching this video. People who care enough to spend 17 minutes trying to actually understand what is happening, not just consume a 30-second headline. People who ask hard questions. People who demand more from their governments than slogans and threats in the comfortable illusion that war is ever truly won. Because in a world this connected, in a conflict this consequential, there are no spectators. The Strait of Hormuz affects your gas prices. Iran's nuclear program affects your security. Lebanon's children are as human as your children. We are all part of this story. And the ending, whatever it turns out to be, is still being written. Thank you for watching. If this gave you some